What if your own father decided you were too peculiar, too headstrong, and too troublesome for any man to wed, and then made a choice that reverberated across an entire plantation? A choice no affluent man in Virginia had ever dared to make. In 1856, on a serene Virginia plantation, a proud landowner made a decision that set his neighbors murmuring, his overseers staggering, and his enslaved workers utterly astonished. His daughter Sophia was deemed unmarriageable. No upstanding family would accept her. No gentleman pursued her hand. So, her father made a choice that history never anticipated. He gave her to the mightiest slave on the plantation, a man many dreaded for his sheer power, yet whom the enslaved respected for something far deeper. His name was Tony, but no one on that plantation realized it. That decision would ignite secrets, tension, forbidden passions, and a series of events that would shake the plantation to its foundation. Welcome to Veil of Fear, where we unearth the powerful stories history tried to bury. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Your city, your country, and what time it is there now. Our community is growing worldwide, and we cherish hearing from each of you. And if you enjoy powerful historical tales like this, please subscribe and hit like so you never miss the hidden stories of the past. Now, settle in and listen closely, because the story you're about to hear took place in 1856 on a quiet Virginia plantation. It started with a daughter no man would wed, and a slave whose strength made even overseers step aside as he walked by. The Whitmore plantation sat in the Virginia countryside, bordered by rolling tobacco fields that stretched across the horizon like green waves beneath the hot southern sun. The Whitmore family had held the land for generations, and it had grown into one of the region's largest plantations. Hundreds of acres of tobacco were planted each season, and dozens of enslaved men and women labored from sunrise until darkness fell. The plantation house stood tall on a small hill overlooking the fields. A grand white building with wide wooden pillars and tall windows that let the owner gaze out across the land he thought he fully controlled. Edward Whitmore was the master of this land, a proud, stubborn man who placed deep faith in order, reputation, and the traditions of the Southern elite. He valued control above all else. A plantation, he believed, had to run like a machine, everyone knowing their place and never stepping beyond society's drawn lines. To Edward, enslaved workers were property meant to generate profit. Overseers were tools to enforce discipline, and his family existed to protect the Whitmore name. Reputation mattered more to him than kindness, fairness, or sometimes even truth. In Virginia society, the Whitmore name carried weight, and Edward intended to keep it that way, no matter what decisions he had to make. But inside that grand house on the hill lived someone who didn't fit easily into Edward Whitmore's orderly world. His only daughter, Sophia, had grown into a woman who refused to act like other wealthy plantation owners' daughters. From outside, she appeared elegant and composed, with dark hair flowing past her shoulders and eyes that seemed perpetually deep in thought. But beneath that calm surface lived a mind that questioned everything around her. She asked questions polite society preferred to ignore. She read books most Virginia women were never encouraged to read. She often wandered from the house alone, walking near the edges of the fields where enslaved workers toiled under the overseer's watchful eyes. Sophia had always been different, even as a child. While other girls practiced music or embroidery, Sophia sat beside windows with books on history, languages, and distant lands. The house servants sometimes whispered she had a scholar's mind trapped inside a plantation daughter's expectations. Her father frequently scolded her for speaking too boldly at dinner or questioning customs everyone else accepted without argument. But Sophia rarely backed down even when it angered her father. Over time, her reputation spread beyond the Whitmore plantation. Families from nearby estates would visit for dinners, bringing sons searching for wives. Many initially thought Sophia would make an excellent match. Educated, wealthy, and quietly confident. But those same young men often left unsettled. Sophia didn't speak like a woman preparing to live quietly under a husband's authority. She spoke like someone who expected to be heard. Some admired her intelligence at first, but admiration quickly curdled into discomfort. Virginia society expected women to be gentle, agreeable, and obedient. Sophia Whitmore was none of those things. She had opinions. She asked hard questions. Sometimes she even challenged statements made by visiting men during dinner. After a few such visits, invitations from those families slowly stopped arriving. Edward noticed the pattern long before Sophia did. Each season, he expected letters from neighboring plantation owners about possible marriage arrangements. Those letters stopped coming. At first, he thought it was coincidence. Then months passed, then years, and still no family approached him with serious interest in his daughter. This troubled him deeply. In his world, marriage wasn't just about love or companionship. It was about alliances between powerful families, strengthening reputations, securing business relationships, and ensuring wealth stayed within respected circles. A daughter who remained unmarried was not only unusual, it was embarrassing. Edward did everything to fix the problem. He arranged dinners with influential families, invited guests from distant plantations, even traveled to nearby towns to introduce Sophia to respectable young men. But every time, the result was the same. Polite interest at first, but none returned with serious intentions. Whispers slowly spread among Virginia's plantations. Some said Sophia was too outspoken. Others claimed she had strange ideas about freedom and equality. A few exaggerated stories even suggested she spent too much time observing enslaved workers in the fields. None of these rumors were confirmed, but in the tightly connected society of plantation families, rumors could be as powerful as truth. Sophia herself seemed strangely unconcerned. She kept reading, walking the land, and speaking her mind whenever she felt necessary. She didn't appear desperate for a husband the way other women were expected to be. In fact, she sometimes looked relieved whenever another potential suitor stopped visiting. But Edward didn't feel relief. He felt humiliation growing quietly around him. Other plantation owners began asking careful questions about Sophia's future. Some offered polite sympathy. Others avoided the subject entirely, which made things even more uncomfortable. As the years passed, Sophia reached the age when most Virginia women were already married and raising children. Yet she remained in her father's house with no husband and no engagement on the horizon. The whispers grew stronger, and Edward began hearing a word that made his blood boil whenever it reached his ears: unmarriageable. That word carried heavy weight in that society. It meant a woman had somehow failed to meet expectations. It meant respectable men wouldn't risk their reputation by marrying her. It meant the family would forever carry the quiet embarrassment attached to her situation. Edward refused to accept that label for his daughter, but anger alone couldn't change the reality forming around him. The truth was becoming impossible to ignore. No respectable man wanted to marry Sophia Whitmore. While these tensions built inside the big house, life continued in the tobacco fields, where dozens of enslaved workers labored under the sun. Among them was a man whose presence commanded attention without a single word. Tony. Tony had arrived at the Whitmore plantation years earlier, sold from another estate further south. No one knew much about his past, and Tony rarely spoke of it. What people noticed immediately was his extraordinary strength. He stood taller than most men and carried a build that made heavy labor look effortless. While three men struggled to lift a tobacco barrel onto a wagon, Tony could sometimes move one by himself. Overseers often relied on him for the toughest tasks, though they remained cautious around him because power like his could easily become dangerous if pushed too far. But Tony wasn't known only for strength. Among the enslaved workers, he had earned something far more valuable than fear: respect. He rarely raised his voice and never wasted energy on unnecessary conflict. When arguments broke out, he often stepped in quietly and calmed things before the overseer noticed. Older workers appreciated his calm nature. Younger ones admired his quiet confidence. Even Overseer Caleb Harris had learned to treat Tony differently. Harris was a harsh man who ruled the fields with intimidation and punishment. Yet he understood that provoking Tony unnecessarily could create problems he didn't want to handle. From the windows of the plantation house, Sophia often noticed Tony working in the fields. At first, it was simply his strength that caught her eye, but over time she observed something else. Tony moved through the fields with a calm focus that seemed different from the exhaustion surrounding him. He worked efficiently, but without the desperation many others carried. Sometimes Sophia stood by the window longer than she intended, watching him organize work or assist someone who'd collapsed from heat. Something about him made her curious. She didn't yet realize that curiosity would soon place both of them at the center of a decision no one on the Whitmore plantation could have imagined. And on a warm evening in the summer of 1856, Edward Whitmore stood on his porch, watching the workers return from the fields. His eyes stopped on one man carrying two heavy barrels across the yard, as if they were empty baskets. In that moment, an idea entered Edward's mind. A shocking idea, a dangerous idea, an idea that would change the fate of Sophia and the strongest slave on the plantation. And once it formed, Edward wouldn't let it go. The evening air over the Whitmore plantation carried the heavy scent of tobacco leaves, drying in the barns. The sun was slowly sinking behind Virginia's distant hills, painting the sky in deep oranges and reds. Edward sat alone on the wide wooden porch, his chair tilted slightly back as he stared across the endless fields. From where he sat, he could see the enslaved workers returning from the day's labor, figures moving slowly across the dusty ground as overseers guided them toward the quarters. To most plantation owners, it was an ordinary sight, the daily close of another day of profit and toil. But on this particular evening, Edward watched more carefully because his mind was restless. For weeks, his thoughts had circled the same problem: his daughter Sophia. Every day, without a marriage arrangement, felt like another small wound to his pride. In Virginia society, reputation was everything. Wealth mattered. Land mattered. Family name mattered. But nothing shaped a man's reputation more than how well his household reflected society's expectations. A daughter who remained unmarried past a certain age was seen as a failure of upbringing, a sign something was wrong with the family itself. Edward refused to accept that judgment. Yet he could feel it growing around him, like fog creeping across the land. Earlier that week he'd received a letter from a neighboring plantation owner, Charles Ridley. Edward had hoped it might contain the news he'd been waiting for. Perhaps interest in Sophia from Ridley's eldest son. Instead, it carried polite words that barely hid their meaning. Charles thanked Edward for the dinner invitation and spoke kindly of Sophia's intelligence, but ended with a careful statement that his son had already begun considering another match elsewhere. The words were respectful, yet the meaning was clear. Another door had closed. Edward crumpled the letter and tossed it into the fireplace that afternoon. As the paper burned, he stared into the flames with an anger he didn't fully understand. Was it at the Ridley family or at Sophia herself for refusing to behave like other plantation owners' daughters? Perhaps both. In his mind, a daughter's purpose was simple: marry well and strengthen the family's position. Sophia seemed determined to resist that purpose at every turn. While Edward sat on the porch lost in thought, the enslaved workers continued crossing the yard below. Some with heavy steps after an exhausting day, others carrying tools for storage. Overseer Harris followed on horseback, watching closely to ensure no one slowed the line. Then Edward's eyes landed on a familiar figure. Tony, the strong slave, walking near the back of the group, carrying 2 large tobacco barrels at once. Normally moved by several men, Tony held one under each arm as if the weight meant nothing. His steps were steady, his back straight, muscles moving beneath his shirt like coiled rope. Edward leaned forward in his chair. He'd noticed Tony's strength before. Everyone had. But tonight something held his attention longer. Tony placed the barrels beside the storage shed, then turned to help another worker struggling with a heavy bundle of tobacco leaves. Edward watched closely. Tony lifted the bundle easily, placed it where it needed to go, and returned to his own work without a word. No pride, no attempt to impress. Just the work, done and done. Edward slowly rubbed his chin. An idea had begun forming earlier that week. A strange idea that had at first seemed ridiculous, yet the more he thought about it, the more it refused to disappear. Sophia was unmarriageable in Virginia society's eyes. But what if that problem could be solved in a completely different way? Edward sat upright as the thought grew clearer. If no respectable man wished to marry Sophia, perhaps a respectable man wasn't necessary at all. The idea sounded shocking, even in his own mind. Yet Edward had never been afraid of unusual decisions when they served his interests. After all, the enslaved people on his plantation were his property. Their labor, movement, even family relationships controlled by his authority. What stopped him from using that authority in a new way? His eyes drifted back to Tony, now stacking tools beside the shed. Tony was strong, disciplined, and respected among the slaves. He caused few problems and worked harder than most. If Edward had to choose one enslaved man who stood above the others, Tony would easily be that man. A slow smile appeared on Edward's face. Perhaps the solution had been standing in his fields all along. Inside the plantation house, Sophia sat near a window reading a book as evening light faded. The book rested gently in her hands, but her attention had drifted several minutes earlier. Instead, she stared across the fields where the workers were finishing their day. She often found herself watching this way. Something about the movement of people working under open sky captured her curiosity. She'd spent years listening to plantation owners speak of slavery as if it were a simple system of labor and profit. Yet, when she watched the workers herself, she saw something far more complicated. Exhaustion, quiet suffering, determination in people denied control over their own lives. Among those workers, she often noticed Tony. It was hard not to. His strength alone made him stand out, but there was something else. While many carried a defeated posture, Tony moved with calm purpose. He didn't rush to please the overseers, yet he completed every task with careful focus. Sophia closed her book and leaned closer to the window. She watched Tony help another worker lift a heavy load. For a brief moment, the two men exchanged a quiet nod before returning to their tasks. Sophia wondered about his life before the plantation. What experiences shaped the calm strength she observed from a distance? Of course, she'd never spoken to him directly. A plantation owner's daughter didn't casually approach enslaved workers for conversation. Society's rules were strict, and breaking them could create serious consequences. Yet curiosity didn't always obey the rules. Sophia sometimes felt trapped by expectations. Every conversation, decision, movement was observed by a society demanding she behave in a specific way. Smile politely, speak gently, marry a man chosen through careful family arrangements. But that future had begun slipping away. Suitors stopped coming. Invitations stopped arriving. Sophia noticed the change in her father's behavior too. Edward had grown quieter around her over the past year, sometimes studying her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Disappointment, frustration, perhaps both. As darkness covered the plantation grounds, Edward finally stood from his porch chair. The idea in his mind had grown too strong to ignore. It was unusual, even shocking, but Edward believed in solving problems through decisive action. If society refused to accept Sophia as a bride for their sons, then Edward would create his own solution. He turned toward the front door and called for a servant. Within moments, a house servant approached, head lowered. Edward spoke with calm authority. "Tell Overseer Harris to come to my study tonight. I have something important to discuss." The servant nodded quickly and hurried away. Edward stepped inside and walked slowly toward his study, already shaping the details of his decision. He understood the idea might shock some people, but he also understood something else. No one on this plantation had the power to challenge him. Not the overseer, not the enslaved workers, not even Sophia herself. Later that night, Overseer Harris entered the study with a cautious expression. He'd been working on plantations for years and knew that when a plantation owner summoned him after dark, it usually meant something serious. Edward stood beside his desk looking out the window. "Close the door, Harris." The overseer obeyed. Edward turned slowly to face him. Harris noticed his employer looked unusually thoughtful. "Sir, you asked to see me." Edward walked to his desk and rested both hands on its surface. "Yes, Harris. I've been considering a matter concerning my daughter." Harris raised his eyebrows slightly but remained silent. Edward continued in a calm, measured tone. "You know the situation. Sophia has reached an age where she should already be married, yet no family has stepped forward with a proposal." Harris nodded carefully. "Yes, sir. People have been talking about it." Edward's eyes hardened slightly. "I'm aware of the talk." He paused. "Since society refuses to provide a husband for my daughter, I've decided to solve the problem myself." Harris felt strange tension in the room. "What do you mean, sir?" Edward spoke the next word slowly. "Tomorrow morning, I want you to bring the slave named Tony to the big house." Harris blinked in confusion. "Tony, sir?" "Yes, the strong one." Harris hesitated.
"Sir, may I ask why?"
Edward looked directly into the overseer's eyes. "Because I've decided that Tony will become my daughter's husband." The room fell completely silent. For several seconds, Harris couldn't speak. In all his years on plantations, he'd never heard such a decision. Finally, he managed to whisper, "Sir, people will talk." Edward's voice remained cold and firm. "Let them talk." What Harris didn't yet realize was that the decision had already been made. And by the time the sun rose the next morning, the entire Whitmore plantation would be whispering about the most shocking order Edward had ever given. The morning sun rose slowly over the Whitmore plantation, spreading pale golden light across the wide Virginia tobacco fields. A thin layer of mist clung to the ground as enslaved workers began gathering near the tool shed for another long day of labor. Roosters crowded beyond the barns, and quiet sounds of early morning filled the air. To most, it felt like any other day. The same routine shaping their lives for years: receive tasks, move into the fields, work until bodies could barely carry them back at night. Yet unknown to almost everyone, this morning would soon become one of the most unusual days the plantation had ever witnessed. Tony stood among the workers near the back, waiting calmly as Overseer Harris, walked along the line inspecting everyone. Tony's tall figure and broad shoulders made him easy to recognize even in the crowd. He held a wooden tool, ready for whatever task he'd be assigned. The muscles in his arms moved slightly as he adjusted his grip, but his face remained quiet and thoughtful. Tony had learned long ago that surviving plantation life required patience and awareness. A careless word or unnecessary action could attract overseer attention, and attention rarely brought anything good. As the workers stood in silence, Harris suddenly stopped and turned his eyes toward Tony. "You there, Tony?" The strong slave lifted his head slightly. "Yes, sir." Harris studied him for a moment as if measuring something. "Leave the tools and come with me." A few workers nearby glanced at Tony with quiet curiosity. Being called away from the morning work line was never normal. Sometimes it meant punishment, sometimes a special task near the house. No one could ever be certain. Tony placed the tool carefully on the ground and stepped forward. "Yes, sir." Without another word, Harris turned and began walking toward the big house on the hill. Tony followed a few steps behind, his long stride steady and calm. As they crossed the yard, several workers whispered, "Why are they calling Tony up there? Maybe the master needs something heavy moved. Or maybe Harris caught him doing something wrong." But those who knew Tony best shook their heads. Tony rarely made mistakes. He kept his head down and did his work. Whatever this was, it was something different. Inside the big house, Edward stood near his study window, watching the two figures approach from across the yard. He'd been awake for hours thinking about the decision he'd made the night before. Now morning had arrived and the moment of action had come. Some men might have doubted themselves after sleeping on such an unusual idea. But Edward wasn't that kind of man. Once he believed a decision would solve his problem, he carried it forward without hesitation. His daughter was unmarriageable in Virginia society's eyes. Very well. If society refused to help him protect his reputation, he'd create his own solution. Edward adjusted his coat cuffs and waited. Moments later, a servant knocked. "Sir, Overseer Harris has arrived. Tony is with him." Edward nodded calmly. "Send them in." The door opened. Harris entered first, Tony behind him, stopping several steps inside. The study felt quiet and heavy with tension. Tony lowered his head respectfully. Edward walked slowly around his desk and studied the tall slave standing before him. Up close, Tony appeared even stronger than in the fields. Shoulders wide, arms thick with muscle, posture straight despite years of forced labor. Edward spoke calmly. "Tony, yes, sir. You've worked on this plantation for many years now." "Yes, sir. You're known as one of the strongest workers I own on it." Tony remained silent for a moment. "I do my work, sir." Edward nodded slightly. "Yes, I've noticed." He walked slowly across the room as if considering his words. "Tell me something. Are you a man who respects authority?" Tony answered without hesitation, "Yes, sir." "And are you a man who keeps his word?" "Yes, sir." Edward stopped and looked directly into Tony's eyes. "Good, because what I'm about to tell you requires both respect and obedience." Tony felt strange tension forming in his chest, though his face remained calm. He'd stood before plantation owners before, but something about the way Edward was speaking felt different. Edward spoke slowly. "Tony, I've decided to give you a special responsibility." Tony remained silent, waiting. Edward continued. "You will no longer spend all your days working in the fields." Tony blinked in surprise. Edward's voice became firm. "Instead, you will begin living under the protection of this house." For a moment, Tony thought he might have misunderstood. "Sir," Edward cut in, "you will become the husband of my daughter, Sophia." The room froze in silence. Harris shifted his weight, still shocked even though he'd heard the decision the night before. Tony stood completely still for several seconds, not because he wished to disobey, but because his mind struggled to comprehend what he just heard. The husband of the plantation owner's daughter. Tony finally managed quietly, "Sir, I don't understand." Edward's expression remained cold and confident. "You don't need to understand. You need to obey." He stepped closer. "No man of respectable family has stepped forward to marry my daughter. Therefore, I've chosen a different solution." Tony's heart beat faster, though he forced calm. "Sir, she is your daughter." Edward's voice sharpened. "And you are my property. Which means I decide what role you'll play." Tony lowered his head again. "Yes, sir." Edward continued. "You will move into the small house near the orchard. It will be prepared for you today." Tony remained silent. "You will treat my daughter with respect and obedience. You will do as you're told." Tony spoke carefully. "Yes, sir." But inside a storm of confusion had begun. Why would a plantation owner do such a thing? Why him? What would the daughter think? Edward turned toward Harris. "Prepare the house near the orchard. I want it ready before sunset." Harris nodded. "Yes, sir." Tony remained standing in the center of the study. Edward looked at him again. "You may return to your work for now." Tony nodded quietly. "Yes, sir." Harris opened the door and motioned for Tony to follow. They stepped outside into warm morning air. As they walked down the hill toward the yard, Harris glanced sideways at Tony. "You heard the master." Tony nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." Harris lowered his voice. "Never seen anything like this before." Tony didn't respond. His mind was still processing the strange decision forced upon him. When they reached the yard, several workers looked toward them with curiosity. Tony returned to the work line without speaking. But the overseer's earlier order had already spread whispers among the workers. They watched him carefully as he picked up his tool again. One worker leaned closer. "What the master want?" Tony answered quietly. "Nothing you need worry about." But the whispers continued anyway. Something strange was happening inside the big house. Sophia had just finished breakfast when her father entered the dining room. She noticed his serious expression. "Father." Edward sat down across from her. "Sophia, I have made a decision about your future." Sophia felt a small knot of tension form in her stomach. She'd heard that tone before. It usually meant he'd already decided something important. "What decision?" Edward spoke calmly. "You're going to be married." Sophia's eyes widened. "Married?" After years of silence on the subject, the sudden announcement felt surprising. To whom? Edward didn't hesitate. To a man named Tony. Sophia blinked in confusion. "Tony?" Edward nodded. "One of the slaves on this plantation." For a moment, Sophia couldn't speak. The idea sounded so unexpected it felt unreal. Her mind searched for words. "Father, you can't be serious." Edward's expression didn't change. "I'm completely serious." Sophia slowly placed her cup down. "You are giving me to a slave." Edward's voice remained firm. "I am giving you a husband." Sophia stared at him in disbelief. "Do you understand what people will say?" Edward leaned forward. "People are already talking. They call you unmarriageable." The word hung heavily between them. Sophia's face tightened. Edward continued. "No respectable man wishes to marry you. Therefore, I have chosen a man myself." Sophia whispered slowly. "Tony." Edward nodded. "Yes." Sophia leaned back in her chair, trying to understand the situation. Somewhere in her memory, she pictured the tall, strong man she'd seen working in the fields. The quiet one. The one who rarely spoke. Who carried barrels as if they weighed nothing. Her father's voice broke the silence. "You will meet him this evening." Sophia remained still for several seconds. Then she said something Edward didn't expect. "Very well." Edward raised his eyebrows. "You accept this?" Sophia looked directly at him. "I will meet him." Edward nodded slowly. "Good." But neither father nor daughter yet understood something important. This strange marriage decision would soon change far more than just their lives. Because once the news began spreading across the Whitmore plantation, curiosity, fear, and hidden emotions would rise among everyone who heard it. Before long, the quiet name Tony would be spoken across the entire plantation with shock and fascination. By midday, the Whitmore plantation no longer felt like a quiet place where every day followed the same routine. The news had begun spreading through the fields like fire through dry grass. At first, it moved slowly, carried in whispers between workers bending over tobacco plants. But within a few hours, almost every enslaved man and woman had heard the unbelievable story. The master had chosen Tony, the strongest slave, to marry his own daughter. Some refused to believe it at first. Others laughed nervously, assuming someone had misunderstood an order. But as more people repeated the same story, whispers grew louder and disbelief slowly turned into stunned curiosity. Tony tried to ignore the attention as he continued working in the fields. He moved through the rows of tobacco plants just as he always had, carefully cutting leaves and placing them into bundles for drying. Yet he could feel other workers, eyes turning toward him again and again. Every few minutes someone nearby would glance his way, then quickly look away when he noticed. The quiet respect he'd earned over the years was now mixed with something new, something heavier. The other workers were no longer just watching him as the strongest man among them. Now they were looking at him as someone who had somehow become part of the master's family. One older worker named Samuel finally stepped closer while the overseer was busy at the far end of the field. Samuel had worked on the plantation longer than almost anyone else. His hair had turned gray. His back bore marks from years of hard labor. Yet his voice still carried quiet authority among the workers. He lowered his voice so the overseer wouldn't hear. "Tony, they say the master called you up to the house this morning." Tony kept his eyes on the tobacco leaves. "Yes," Samuel hesitated. "And they say something strange happened there." Tony stopped work briefly and wiped sweat from his hands onto his shirt. Samuel watched him carefully. Finally, Tony spoke in a low voice. "The master says I am to marry his daughter." The words sounded almost unreal even as he said them. Samuel stared at him in silence for several seconds, as if his mind needed time to catch up. Then he whispered slowly, "You telling me the truth?" Tony nodded once. Samuel shook his head in disbelief. "I've been on plantations most of my life. I've heard many strange stories, but I never heard nothing like that." Other workers nearby had begun pretending to focus on their work while secretly listening. A young woman named Lydia leaned slightly closer while tying a bundle of leaves. Did the daughter agree to it? Tony answered honestly, "I don't know. The master said I will meet her this evening." Workers exchanged quiet glances. Samuel finally spoke again. "Son, this kind of thing never ends simple." Tony understood the warning hidden in those words. Nothing involving the master's family could ever be simple for a slave. Yet there was nothing he could do. The decision had already been made. While workers whispered in the fields, a different conversation was taking place inside the big house on the hill. Sophia stood near her bedroom window, looking out across the plantation. The afternoon sun lit the fields with bright gold, and in the distance she could see workers moving slowly between rows of tobacco plants. Somewhere among them was the man her father had chosen for her. The thought still felt strange each time it crossed her mind. Sophia had spent the past hour trying to understand her father's decision. At first, she'd felt shock and anger. The idea that Edward could simply decide her marriage without asking her opinion wasn't surprising. But the chosen husband's identity had shaken her. A slave. Not just any slave, but one who'd spent years working in the fields below her window. She'd seen him many times from a distance, though she'd never spoken to him. Her father's words returned. "They call you unmarriageable." Sophia had heard the whispers, long before her father admitted them openly. Society had slowly closed its doors to her. Other plantation owners' daughters often married young and disappeared into new homes filled with children and social gatherings. Sophia had remained behind. Some believed she was too outspoken. Others believed she was too curious about things respectable women weren't meant to question. Sophia leaned her hand against the window frame and looked again at the distant workers. She tried to remember exactly what Tony looked like. Her memory formed a picture of a tall man with powerful shoulders and calm eyes. He'd always seemed different from others in the field, not arrogant, not defiant, but steady in a way that caught her attention. A quiet knock came at the door. "Come in." A house servant entered and bowed slightly. "Miss Sophia, your father asked me to tell you that the meeting will take place after supper. The man named Tony will be brought to the orchard house." Sophia nodded slowly. "Thank you." The servant left, closing the door softly. Sophia returned her gaze to the fields. "So, this evening I will meet the man my father has chosen." The thought carried a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. She didn't know what to expect. Would he fear her? Resent her? Would he even dare to speak openly in her presence? Sophia suddenly realized something else. This decision might have been forced upon Tony even more harshly than it had been forced upon her. As afternoon slowly turned toward evening, Harris supervised preparation of the small house near the orchard. The building had originally been used to store tools and supplies, but servants were now cleaning it quickly under his instructions. A bed was placed inside with a wooden table and 2 chairs. Fresh water was carried in, and small windows opened to let warm air flow through. Harris stood outside the doorway watching with a thoughtful expression. One servant finally spoke quietly. "Sir, is it true what people are saying?" Harris glanced at him. "What people saying about Tony marrying the master's daughter?" The servant looked confused. "But sir, how can that even happen?" Harris shrugged slightly. "Not our place to ask questions." But even as he said the words, Harris himself still struggled to understand. He'd worked under many plantation owners, yet none had ever made a decision like this. By the time the sun began sinking toward the horizon, the entire plantation buzzed with quiet conversations. Workers returning from the fields spoke of nothing else. Even house servants whispered about the coming meeting. Inside the big house, Edward finished his supper calmly. Across the table, Sophia ate quietly, though her thoughts were far away. Finally, Edward set down his napkin. "It is time." Sophia looked up. "Wes," Edward stood and walked toward the door. "Come with me." Outside, the sky had turned deep orange as the sun dipped lower. Orchard trees cast long shadows across the grass. The small house stood quietly among them, its door slightly open. Tony was already standing outside with Harris nearby. He'd been brought from the fields shortly before sunset and told to wait. When Tony saw Edward and Sophia walking toward him, he straightened his posture. For the first time, he was seeing the master's daughter up close. Sophia walked beside her father with calm steps, though her heart beat faster than usual. Edward stopped several feet in front of Tony. "Tony." "Yes, sir." Edward gestured toward Sophia. "This is my daughter." Tony lowered his head respectfully. "Miss." Sophia studied him carefully. Up close, she noticed details distance had hidden. She saw strength in his shoulders, quiet steadiness in his eyes, marks of hard labor on his hands. Edward spoke firmly. "Tonight you two will speak and become acquainted." Tony remained silent. Sophia finally spoke. "Your name is Tony." "Yes, miss." She nodded slowly. "My father tells me we are to be married." Tony hesitated before answering. "Yes, miss." For several seconds, none of them spoke. The evening air moved softly through orchard leaves. Then Sophia said something that surprised both men. "Perhaps we should speak alone." Edward looked at her carefully. "Very well." He turned toward Harris. "We will wait by the house." The two men stepped away, leaving Sophia and Tony alone outside the small building. For the first time, they were alone. Sophia looked directly at the man who had suddenly become the center of her future. Tony stood quietly, unsure what she might say. The silence felt heavy with unspoken questions. Finally, Sophia spoke softly. "Did you choose this?" Tony answered honestly. "No, miss." She nodded slowly. "Neither did I." For a brief moment, their eyes met, and in that moment, both realized something important. Their lives had just been tied together by a decision neither had made. But what happened next depended entirely on what they chose to do from this point forward. The evening air moved gently through the orchard trees, carrying the quiet rustling of leaves across the small clearing. The sky had begun turning darker shades of blue as the sun disappeared beyond distant fields. A few lanterns had been lit near the main house on the hill, their faint glow flickering through the branches. In the middle of the orchard, Sophia and Tony stood facing one another for the first time, without Edward or Harris directly beside them. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence felt heavy, not with hostility, but with uncertainty. Both understood that their lives had just been forced together by a decision made by someone else. Sophia studied Tony carefully. Up close, she could see small details distance had hidden. Hands rough from labor, shoulders broad and strong from countless days in the fields. Yet his eyes held a calm steadiness that surprised her. Tony kept his head slightly lowered at first, a habit built from years of strict obedience. Speaking too boldly to a white woman, especially the plantation owner's daughter, could be dangerous. Yet this situation was unlike anything he'd experienced before. Sophia finally broke the silence. "You don't have to call me miss when we're alone." Tony looked up slowly, unsure if he'd heard correctly. She continued quietly, "My name is Sophia." Tony nodded carefully. "Yes, Sophia." It felt strange to say her name, but she didn't appear offended. Sophia folded her hands together and looked around the small clearing. "My father believes this arrangement will solve his problem." Tony remained quiet. The problem of having a daughter no one wishes to marry. Tony understood the meaning. Plantation workers heard many things through whispers and passing conversations. Even slaves in the fields knew the master's daughter had never received a marriage proposal. Sophia looked back at him. "But this decision wasn't made for your sake or mine." Tony answered honestly, "No, it was made for him." Sophia nodded slowly. "Exactly." The lantern light from the distant house flickered through branches above them, casting soft shadows across the ground. The orchard felt quiet, almost peaceful compared to the strict order of the plantation fields. Tony finally spoke again. "Why did you agree to meet me?" Sophia considered the question. "Because I wanted to see the man whose life has just been tied to mine." Tony said nothing. Sophia studied him again. "You don't seem afraid." Tony thought carefully. "Fear is not useful when you can't change what's happening." Sophia raised her eyebrows. "That's a very honest answer." Tony simply nodded. Sophia walked a few steps toward the small house and glanced inside through the open doorway. A bed, wooden table, 2 chairs, simple, but far more comfortable than the slave quarters where Tony had lived. She turned back. "This will be your home now." Tony looked at the doorway quietly. Aye, so." Sophia noticed the careful tone. "You don't sound pleased." Tony hesitated. On a plantation like this, a man learns not to expect pleasure from decisions made by others. Sophia felt the truth of that statement more deeply than expected. She leaned slightly against the door frame. "Tell me something honestly. Tony waited. What do the other slaves think about this? Tony almost smiled. They think it's the strangest thing they've ever heard. Sophia let out a quiet breath. I imagine the plantation owners around us will say the same. Tony spoke carefully. Your father doesn't seem worried about their opinions. Sophia shook her head. My father rarely worries about what others think, once he believes he's right. Tony looked toward the distant main house. That kind of confidence is powerful. Sophia followed his gaze, and sometimes dangerous. The night grew darker around them. Crickets had begun chirping beyond the orchard trees. After several moments, Sophia spoke again. I want to make something clear. Tony listened carefully. This marriage wasn't my choice, but I will not treat you as a prisoner of it. Tony frowned, slightly confused. What do you mean? Sophia spoke slowly. My father may believe he's created a solution for his reputation, but that doesn't mean we must live as strangers trapped in the same house. Tony considered her words. You're saying we should try to understand each other? Sophia nodded. Yes. Tony looked thoughtful. That would be unusual for a plantation. Sophia almost smiled. Everything about this situation is unusual. For the first time, the tension between them softened slightly. Tony finally asked a question of his own. Lee. Why did no one want to marry you? Sophia didn't appear offended. Instead, she looked out toward the fields. Because I speak too freely. Tony waited. Because I ask questions many people don't want to answer. She paused. And because I don't pretend that slavery is something noble. Tony felt a quiet shock run through him. Very few white people on plantations ever spoke that truth openly. Sophia noticed his reaction. Does that surprise you? Tony answered honestly, yes. Sophia nodded slowly. It surprises my father as well. For a moment, they both stood in silence again. Then Tony spoke quietly. You understand what people will say about you after this. Sophia met his eyes calmly. They were already saying many things about me. Tony nodded slightly. This will make the whispers louder. Sophia looked toward the dark fields. Perhaps it's time the whispers became something else. Tony frowned. Something else. Sophia turned back. Change. The word hung quietly in the air between them. Tony didn't respond immediately. He'd spent most of his life surviving under a system that allowed little room for hope. The idea that anything on a plantation could truly change felt distant. Sophia noticed his hesitation. You don't believe change is possible? Tony answered carefully. I believe powerful people rarely allow change unless they benefit from it. Sophia nodded slowly. That is true, but sometimes change begins where no one expects it. Tony studied her face. Why are you telling me this? Sophia looked toward the orchard trees. Because something strange has just happened on this plantation. Tony waited. A slave and a plantation owner's daughter are standing together having a conversation that would shock every plantation owner in Virginia. Tony couldn't deny that. Sophia continued, that alone means the rules have already begun bending. Tony looked thoughtful. From the distance, they could see Edward and Harris standing near the main house watching the orchard. Sophia noticed them as well. My father is probably wondering what we're discussing. Tony said quietly, he expects obedience. Sophia looked back. And what do you expect? Tony answered slowly, for now I expect survival. Sophia nodded. That's a good place to begin. She stepped away from the doorway. We should return before my father grows impatient. Tony followed her gaze.
Yes.
They began walking together through the orchard grass toward the lights of the big house. As they moved beneath the trees, Tony realized something he hadn't expected. The fear he felt earlier that day had changed into something else, curiosity. And Sophia was beginning to feel the same thing. Neither yet understood where this strange path would lead, but one thing was already certain. The decision made by Edward had not only shocked the Whitmore plantation, it had set forces in motion that none of them could fully control. The night after Sophia and Tony first spoke, the Whitmore plantation didn't sleep easily. Lanterns burned later than usual in the slave quarters as workers whispered about the strange marriage ordered by the master. Some believed it was a cruel experiment. Others thought the master had finally lost his senses. A few even wondered if something deeper was happening, something none yet understood. But while rumors spread through the plantation like wind through dry leaves, two people found themselves standing quietly at the center of the storm. Tony sat alone inside the small orchard house. The lantern on the wooden table flickered softly, casting moving shadows across the walls. The room was far better than the crowded slave quarters where he'd slept for years. Yet the comfort brought him little peace. His entire life had changed in a single day, not through his own choices, but because a plantation owner had decided to solve a problem in the most unusual way possible. Tony rested his hands on the table and stared at the flame, thinking about the conversation with Sophia. She had spoken differently from any white person he'd ever known on a plantation. Not with cold authority or harsh tone, but with curiosity, almost as if trying to understand the world rather than control it. Tony couldn't decide whether that made the situation easier or more dangerous. Trust was difficult for a man who'd spent his life in chains, even invisible ones. Outside the orchard house, night insects sang in the grass. The moon rose slowly above the fields, lighting tobacco rows with pale silver light. Somewhere beyond the orchard, Tony could hear quiet slave voices, still talking about the strange news. Some feared the master's decision might bring trouble to all of them. Others believed Tony had somehow been given an opportunity no slave had ever received before. Tony didn't yet know which was true. Inside the big house on the hill, Sophia also sat awake long after the rest of the household had gone to bed. A book lay open on her desk, but she hadn't turned a page for nearly an hour. Her mind was too busy replaying the day's events. She thought about her father's announcement at the dining table, the shock that must have spread across the plantation when the news reached the fields, and most of all, the man she'd spoken with beneath the orchard trees. Tony had surprised her. She'd expected anger, fear, or silent resentment. Instead, she'd found calm honesty. He didn't pretend the situation was fair, yet he didn't waste energy fighting something he couldn't immediately change. There was strength in that patience, a quiet strength, very different from the loud authority her father used to control everything around him. Sophia stood and walked to her window. From there, she could see the dark outline of the orchard in the distance. Somewhere among those trees stood the small house where Tony was now living. Her father believed he'd solved a problem by forcing this marriage, but Sophia could already see something else forming inside the decision possibility. The following morning, Edward called both Sophia and Tony to the front porch of the big house. The sun had just begun climbing above the fields, spreading warm light across the grounds. Harris stood nearby, watching the meeting carefully. Edward leaned back in his wooden chair with the calm expression of a man who believed everything was under his control. "Well, I trust the two of you had time to become acquainted." Sophia answered first. "We spoke." Edward nodded. "Good." He turned his eyes toward Tony. "And you understand your responsibilities?" Tony spoke carefully. "Yes, sir." Edward folded his hands. "This arrangement will bring stability to my household and silence the foolish gossip that has surrounded my daughter." Sophia watched her father closely as he spoke. She could hear the pride hidden in his voice. To Edward, the situation was simply a clever solution to protect his reputation. But something unexpected happened next. Sophia stepped slightly forward. "Father, may I say something?" Edward looked at her with mild curiosity. "Of course." Sophia turned briefly toward the fields before speaking. "You wanted to silence gossip, but what you've done will not silence anything. It will make the entire county talk louder than before." Edward's expression tightened slightly. "Let them talk." Sophia continued calmly. "They won't only talk about me. They'll talk about you. They'll talk about the plantation, and they'll talk about Tony." Tony remained silent beside her. Edward leaned forward. "And what are you suggesting?" Sophia met his eyes. "If this decision truly means something, then it must be more than just a strange story for neighbors to whisper about." Edward frowned. "Explain yourself." Sophia took a slow breath. "You said Tony is now my husband." Edward nodded. "Yes." "Then he should no longer be treated like a slave." The porch fell silent. Harris looked shocked. Edward stared at his daughter. "That is not what I meant." Sophia spoke calmly but firmly. "It is the only way this decision will make sense." Edward's voice grew colder. "You're asking me to free him?" Sophia answered simply.
Yes.
Tony felt his heart beat faster at the words, though he kept his face calm. Edward stood from his chair and walked slowly across the porch. For several moments he said nothing. The morning wind moved gently across the fields as he thought. Finally, he turned back. "You're asking me to do something that no plantation owner in this region would ever consider." Sophia didn't look away. Perhaps that's exactly why it must be done. Edward studied her face carefully, then looked at Tony. The strong slave stood quietly waiting. Edward had spent his entire life believing he controlled everything on his land, but now his own decision had created a situation beginning to challenge the very rules he'd lived by. Minutes passed before he spoke again. "Very well." Sophia and Tony both looked at him. Edward continued slowly. "If Tony is to stand beside my daughter as her husband, then he cannot remain a slave." The words hung in the air. Harris could barely believe what he was hearing. Edward raised a finger toward Tony. "But understand this clearly. Your freedom will come with expectations. You will work this land as a free man and help maintain the order of this plantation." Tony finally spoke. "Yes, sir." Edward nodded once. "Then it is settled." Word of the decision spread across the Whitmore plantation faster than any rumor before it. By the end of the day, every worker knew Tony was no longer a slave. The strongest man in the fields had become a free man and the husband of the master's daughter. For many slaves, the news felt almost impossible to believe. Some smiled quietly with hope they hadn't felt in years. Others simply stared across the fields, wondering if the world around them was beginning to change. Tony himself walked through the plantation with the same calm steps he'd always carried. But inside, he knew something had shifted forever. For the first time in his life, the future was no longer completely controlled by someone else. Sophia stood beside him that evening beneath the orchard trees, where their first conversation had begun. "You're free now," she said quietly. Tony looked across the fields. He paused. "And everything has changed." Sophia nodded slowly. "Sometimes change begins with the smallest crack in the wall." Tony turned toward her. "Do you think that is what this is?" Sophia smiled faintly. "I think your story will travel farther than this plantation." The wind moved gently through orchard leaves above them. The Whitmore plantation would never again be seen the same way by the people who lived there. What had begun as a desperate decision to protect a reputation had unexpectedly created something else. A story about courage, strange choices, and the moment when the strongest slave on a Virginia plantation became a free man. And long after 1856 passed into history, people would still whisper about the day Edward tried to control fate, and instead opened the door to something he never planned. Before you go, we want to hear from you. What would you have done if you were Sophia? Would you have accepted your father's decision or fought against it? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, your city, your country, and what time it is there right now. And if you enjoy powerful, historical stories like this, please subscribe to Untold Crime History and like this video so you never miss the hidden stories history tried to bury. Because here on Veil of Fear, we don't just tell stories. We bring forgotten history back to life.